The weight of emptiness. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over someone's life when meaning disappears. It's not the peaceful quiet of contentment, but something heavier, a hollowness that makes even simple decisions feel impossible. You wake up, go through the motions, and wonder, what's the point of any of this? If you've ever felt this way, you're not alone. This feeling, this sense that everything seems meaningless, is more common than most people admit. In the mid-20th century, as post-war Britain and the Western world grappled with existential questions, one psychologist began listening to people describe exactly this feeling in his therapy sessions. His name was Carl Rogers, and what he discovered would challenge everything psychology thought it knew about human suffering. Rogers didn't encounter these feelings in abstract philosophy books. He heard them from real people sitting across from him, students at university counseling centers, veterans returning from war, housewives in suburban homes who couldn't explain the numbness they felt. In his practice in London and later in the United States, Rogers noticed a pattern. These people weren't necessarily depressed in the clinical sense. They functioned. They worked. But somewhere inside, a light had gone out. One client described it perfectly: "I feel like I'm watching my own life from behind glass. I do everything I'm supposed to do, but none of it touches me anymore." This wasn't about lacking goals or achievements. Many of Rogers' clients were successful by conventional standards. They had careers, families, accomplishments. Yet they felt fundamentally disconnected from their own existence. The things that supposedly mattered felt arbitrary. The future looked like nothing more than an endless repetition of empty days. Traditional psychology of the era had explanations for this: unresolved childhood trauma, repressed desires, chemical imbalances. And while Rogers didn't dismiss these factors, he noticed something else, something that existing theories couldn't quite capture. The meaninglessness his clients described wasn't just a symptom of something broken. It was, paradoxically, a signal that something was trying to emerge. Rogers had been trained in the prevailing psychoanalytic methods, the therapist as expert, interpreting the patient's unconscious, directing their path to wellness. But his own clinical experience kept contradicting this model. The people who seemed to recover their sense of meaning weren't the ones who accepted the therapist's interpretations most readily. They were the ones who found something authentic within themselves. This observation would become the foundation of what Rogers called person-centered therapy, but more importantly, it would reveal something profound about the nature of meaninglessness itself. What if this feeling wasn't the enemy? What if it was, in fact, the beginning of something essential? The question Rogers kept returning to was simple but radical: what if meaninglessness is what happens when we've strayed too far from who we actually are? The false self and the conditional life. To understand Rogers' answer to meaninglessness, we need to understand his concept of the conditions of worth, an idea that would become central to humanistic psychology. Rogers observed that from our earliest moments, we learn that love and acceptance come with strings attached. Imagine a child in a comfortable British home in the 1950s. She's naturally exuberant, loud, full of physical energy. But repeatedly, she receives messages: "Good girls are quiet. That's not ladylike. Why can't you be more like your sister?" The message becomes clear: who she naturally is isn't quite acceptable. To receive love, approval, and belonging, she needs to be someone slightly different. This isn't necessarily about cruelty or bad parenting. Rogers understood that this process happens in even the most loving families, in schools, in churches, in every social institution. Society operates through shared expectations, and we internalize these expectations as conditions for our own self-worth. We learn, I am valuable when I am successful. I am lovable when I am agreeable. I am worthy when I meet others' expectations. Rogers called the self we construct to meet these conditions the self-concept, the person we believe we should be. And he contrasted this with what he called the organismic self, who we actually are, with our genuine feelings, desires, and values. The gap between these two selves is where meaninglessness grows. Here's what happens: we build our lives around the self-concept. We choose careers that look respectable rather than ones that genuinely interest us. We maintain relationships that appear proper rather than ones that truly nourish us. We pursue goals that society values rather than ones that resonate with our actual being. And for a while, this might work. We might even achieve exactly what we set out to achieve. But there's a cost. Rogers described it as a growing incongruence, a fundamental misalignment between who we're pretending to be and who we actually are. And our organism, our actual self, knows the difference. It registers the disconnection. It feels the inauthenticity. One of Rogers' clients, a successful London barrister, put it this way: "I've won cases that other solicitors dream of winning. I've made partner. I have everything I worked for. But when I stand in court, I feel like a fraud. Not because I'm incompetent, I know I'm good at what I do. But because none of it is mine. I'm performing a role I chose because it would make my father proud, and now he's been dead 5 years and I'm still performing it." This is the mechanism of meaninglessness according to Rogers. Meaning doesn't disappear because life is inherently pointless or because we haven't achieved enough. It disappears because we're living a life that isn't genuinely ours. We're pursuing values we don't actually hold, maintaining relationships that don't actually nourish us, presenting a self that isn't actually real. The existential philosophers of Rogers' era, Sartre, Camus, Heidegger, were describing a similar phenomenon from a different angle. They wrote about bad faith, the absurd, and inauthenticity. But where they often saw this as the fundamental human condition, Rogers saw it as something more specific, a consequence of conditional love and the false self we build to secure it. The feeling that everything is meaningless, then, isn't a philosophical problem requiring a philosophical solution. It's a signal, your actual self trying to get your attention, saying, "This life you're living isn't ours. We need to find our way back." But here's the difficult part: recognizing this doesn't automatically solve it. In fact, it often makes things worse before they get better. Because once you realize you've been living for someone else's values, the question becomes, what are your actual values? And for many people, that's a terrifying void to stare into. Which brings us to what Rogers called the fully functioning person and the path to getting there. The organism's wisdom. Carl Rogers had a conviction that set him apart from much of psychology and philosophy. He believed that human beings have an inherent tendency toward growth, health, and fulfillment. He called this the actualizing tendency, the idea that, given the right conditions, people naturally move toward becoming more complete, more authentic versions of themselves. This wasn't naive optimism. Rogers had sat with deeply troubled people, those paralyzed by anxiety, consumed by self-hatred, lost in meaninglessness. But even in the darkest cases, he observed something persistent, a small voice, often buried, that knew what the person needed. Not what they should need according to theory or social convention, but what they actually needed. He would sometimes reference a simple botanical metaphor. If you plant a seed in fertile soil with adequate water and sunlight, you don't need to instruct it on how to become a plant. The potential is inherent. The organism knows how to actualize itself. The environment's job isn't to direct the process, it's to provide conditions where the natural process can unfold. But here's where it gets complex. Human beings, unlike plants, live in a world of symbols, language, and social meaning. We internalize voices, parents, teachers, culture, religion, that tell us what we should become. These voices aren't necessarily wrong, but they're external. And when they dominate completely, we lose touch with the organism itself, the part of us that knows, without words, what feels right and what doesn't. Rogers discovered this through careful observation in therapy. When clients were given a genuinely non-judgmental space, what he called unconditional positive regard, something remarkable happened. Initially, they would often express the should voices: I should be more ambitious. I should be grateful for what I have. I shouldn't feel this way. But if the therapist remained accepting, patient, and genuinely curious without directing, another voice would eventually emerge. It was often quieter, more tentative. But it was also more real. A client might say, I know I should want to continue in medicine, I'm 3 years into my training, but when I'm honest with myself, I dread every shift. What I actually want, I'm almost embarrassed to say it, is to work with my hands, to build things. This is what Rogers meant by the organism's wisdom. Beneath the layers of conditioning, there's a self that knows what experiences feel enlivening versus deadening, what relationships feel nourishing versus draining, what activities feel meaningful versus hollow. The problem is we've been trained to distrust this knowing, to override it with rational considerations or social expectations. In post-war Britain, where Rogers spent significant time lecturing and training therapists, this idea was particularly radical. British culture prized stoicism, duty, and restraint. The notion that one should listen to one's feelings, that subjective experience had its own validity, seemed almost dangerously indulgent. Rogers faced considerable skepticism from the medical and psychiatric establishment. But his clinical results were undeniable. People who learned to reconnect with their organismic experience, their actual feelings, desires, and values, showed remarkable improvement. Not because a therapist had solved their problems or given them insight, but because they had rediscovered their own inner compass. One client, a middle-aged woman who had spent decades in a marriage that looked perfect from the outside, described the experience. "For years, I told myself I was content. I had everything a woman could want. But there was this small feeling, like a pebble in my shoe, that I was constantly ignoring. In our sessions, when you didn't judge me or try to convince me of anything, I finally let myself feel it. And it wasn't just a pebble, it was the knowledge that I had disappeared. I had become what everyone needed me to be, and I had no idea who I actually was anymore." The path forward, for her and for countless others, began not with acquiring something new, new beliefs, new strategies, new achievements, but with a process of listening. Listening to what her body was telling her. Listening to which experiences made her feel more alive and which made her feel more dead inside. Listening to the organism's wisdom. This is Rogers' first answer to meaninglessness. Meaning isn't found by thinking harder or achieving more. It's found by reconnecting with the self that's been there all along, waiting to be heard. But this process requires something specific, a particular kind of environment. And that's what we need to explore next. The necessary conditions for growth. Rogers didn't just observe that people could reconnect with authentic meaning, he identified the specific conditions that made this possible. These weren't techniques or interventions in the traditional sense. They were qualities of relationship, and they applied not just to therapy but to all human connection. He outlined 3 core conditions, and it's worth understanding each one carefully, because together they create the environment where a person can stop performing and start being. First, congruence, or genuineness. This means the therapist, or friend, or parent, or partner, is authentic in the relationship. They're not hiding behind a professional mask or playing a role. Their inner experience matches their outer expression. If they're confused, they admit it. If they're moved, they show it. This doesn't mean being unfiltered or dumping one's problems on the other person, it means being real. Why does this matter for someone struggling with meaninglessness? Because authenticity is contagious. When you're with someone who is genuinely themselves, it gives you permission to be yourself. Conversely, when everyone around you is performing a role, you learn that performance is what's required for acceptance. Rogers noticed this particularly in British academic and professional settings, where there was often a strong cultural emphasis on maintaining proper appearances. In such environments, people became experts at presenting an acceptable self while their actual experience remained hidden, even from themselves. Congruence was the antidote. One authentic person in a system of performance could create space for others to step out of their roles. Second, unconditional positive regard. This is perhaps Rogers' most famous concept, and it's often misunderstood. It doesn't mean approval of all behaviors or agreement with all choices. It means a fundamental acceptance of the person's worth as separate from their actions or achievements. It means communicating, you have value simply because you exist, not because of what you do or who you become. This was revolutionary in a psychological landscape dominated by diagnosis, judgment, and expert interpretation. Rogers was saying, the client doesn't need to be fixed by an expert. They need to be seen, accepted, and trusted to find their own way. But more than that, he was identifying what had been missing in most people's lives from the beginning: acceptance without conditions. Remember those conditions of worth we discussed? Unconditional positive regard is the antidote. When someone experiences it, genuinely experiences it, not just as words but as felt reality, something shifts. The constant internal monitoring, am I acceptable? Am I doing this right? Am I valuable? Begins to quiet down. And in that quieter space, the organism itself can be heard. A young man Rogers worked with in a university counseling center described it, for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to figure out what answer you wanted or how I should be feeling. I just said what was actually there, including the ugly parts, and you didn't flinch. You didn't try to fix me or convince me I was wrong. You just stayed with me. And weirdly, that's when I started to change. Third, empathic understanding. This means entering the client's frame of reference, seeing the world as they see it, feeling the contours of their experience without losing your own separate identity. It's not sympathy, I feel sorry for you, or identification, that happened to me too. It's the ability to deeply understand another person's subjective world and to communicate that understanding. Rogers would sometimes check his understanding. It sounds like you feel trapped, not just in your job, but in a whole life that you built to please others, and now you can't see a way out without disappointing everyone. Is that close? This kind of reflection helped clients feel truly heard, but it also helped them hear themselves. Often, people don't know what they're feeling until someone reflects it back accurately. Together, these three conditions create what Rogers called a psychologically safe environment. And in such an environment, the natural actualizing tendency can resume. People stop defending, stop performing, stop pretending. They start exploring. They start feeling. They start becoming. But here's what's crucial for someone experiencing meaninglessness: you don't necessarily need a trained therapist to experience these conditions. You need at least one relationship with a friend, a partner, a family member, even with yourself, where these qualities are present. Where you can be genuine, where you're accepted without conditions, where you're deeply understood. For many people, the absence of such a relationship is precisely why meaninglessness takes hold. They're surrounded by conditional acceptance, by people who love the role they play rather than who they are. They've never had space to be anything other than what others need them to be. And in that environment, the authentic self, the only self that can experience genuine meaning, withers. So one of Rogers' answers to meaninglessness is relational: find or create environments where these conditions exist. But there's another dimension to this, a practice that anyone can begin, even in isolation. And that's what we turn to next. The practice of honest self-awareness. Rogers believed that the therapeutic relationship was powerful because it modeled something that could eventually be internalized: the ability to offer yourself the same congruence, acceptance, and empathy that a good therapist provides. In other words, you could develop a different relationship with yourself. This isn't about positive affirmations or forcing yourself to feel differently. It's about honest self-awareness, the practice of turning toward your actual experience with curiosity rather than judgment. For someone lost in meaninglessness, this practice can be the beginning of a way back. Let's be concrete about what this looks like. You're going through your day, performing your various roles: employee, parent, friend, partner, and you notice a familiar heaviness. Everything feels effortful. Nothing feels important. The temptation is to push through, distract yourself, or conclude that something is wrong with you. Rogers would suggest something different: pause and ask yourself, what am I actually feeling right now? Not what you should be feeling, or what would be reasonable to feel, but what's actually present. And then, this is the crucial part, receive the answer without judgment. Maybe the answer is, I feel trapped. Or I feel angry that no one sees me. Or I feel terrified that this is all there is. These aren't pleasant feelings, and your conditioned mind will immediately want to dismiss them, argue with them, or fix them. But Rogers' approach is to simply acknowledge them. Okay, that's what's here. Let me stay with that. This might sound like wallowing, but it's quite the opposite. When feelings are repeatedly pushed away or denied, they don't disappear, they go underground and create that pervasive sense of meaninglessness. When feelings are allowed to be present and witnessed, they tend to move, shift, and often reveal something underneath. Rogers called this experiencing, being in direct contact with what's happening in you, rather than intellectualizing about it or defending against it. He noticed that clients who developed this capacity began to trust their own experience in a new way. They could tell the difference between a feeling that was just old conditioning, I should pursue this prestigious opportunity, and a feeling that was genuinely organismic, this doesn't feel right for me, even though I can't fully explain why. In the British cultural context, this kind of introspection was often viewed with suspicion, too self-indulgent, too emotional, too American perhaps. But Rogers wasn't advocating for endless navel-gazing. He was pointing to something more essential, that you can't build a meaningful life on foundations you won't look at. If you don't know what you actually feel, value, and need, you're building on sand. One practice Rogers sometimes suggested was what we might now call focusing, taking a few minutes to sit quietly and ask yourself, what's the main thing I'm carrying right now? Not to solve it, but just to acknowledge it. A word or image often emerges: pressure, emptiness, a cage, fog. And then you can ask, what does that need from me right now? Sometimes the answer is practical, I need to have a difficult conversation. Sometimes it's more general, I need to stop pretending I'm fine. Sometimes there's no clear answer, just a sense of being less alone with your experience because you've turned toward it rather than away. This practice builds what Rogers called internal locus of evaluation, the ability to assess your own experience rather than constantly looking outside yourself for validation or direction. When everything seems meaningless, it's often because you've given all your evaluative power away. You've let society, family, culture, and circumstances tell you what matters. Honest self-awareness is how you begin to take that power back. But there's a paradox here that's important to understand. You can't force yourself to feel differently or manufacture meaning through willpower. What you can do is create the internal conditions, acceptance, curiosity, honesty, where your organismic self feels safe enough to emerge. And when it emerges, meaning follows naturally. Not imposed meaning, but discovered meaning. Rogers saw this happen again and again. A person would come in describing profound meaninglessness, nothing matters, everything is empty. Through the process of honest exploration, they would discover that it wasn't that nothing mattered. It was that the things they'd been told should matter didn't actually matter to them. And underneath that realization was something real: what actually matters to me is. And that actually makes all the difference. Because meaning that's actually yours, that emerges from your genuine values, feelings, and organismic knowing, has a quality that borrowed meaning never does. It energizes rather than depletes. It feels like coming home rather than striving to arrive somewhere. But this process isn't always comfortable. In fact, it usually involves moving through some difficult territory, which is what we need to explore next. The dark middle, embracing uncertainty. There's a stage in the process of recovering meaning that Rogers observed consistently, and it's worth preparing for. Things often get worse before they get better. When you start being honest with yourself about what you actually feel and value, you often discover a difficult truth: much of the life you've built isn't aligned with that truth. This is what we might call the dark middle, the period between recognizing inauthenticity and finding a way forward. It's characterized by uncertainty, fear, and often a deepening sense of meaninglessness before meaning returns. And it's precisely the stage where many people panic and retreat back to their old patterns. Rogers understood this as a necessary transition. He saw that clients who were beginning to trust their organismic experience would often go through a period of profound disorientation. The old structures, the shoulds, the roles, the conditioned responses, were no longer working, but new structures hadn't yet formed. Imagine a woman who has spent 20 years building a career in finance. It was prestigious, it pleased her family, it provided security. But in the process of honest self-awareness, she realizes that it drains her, that she's been living for retirement rather than for the present, that the person she is at work feels increasingly alien to who she actually is. So what now? The conditioned mind immediately offers solutions: just find a better position in finance. Work less. Take a holiday. You're just burnt out. But the organismic self knows differently. The problem isn't the specific job, it's the entire direction. And facing that truth is terrifying because it means uncertainty. Rogers would often say that the therapeutic process isn't about providing certainty, it's about helping someone develop the capacity to tolerate and even embrace uncertainty. Because life itself is uncertain. The pursuit of absolute security and control is what leads people to build lives around others' values rather than their own. In the British culture of Rogers' era, with its emphasis on stability, tradition, and knowing one's place, this tolerance for uncertainty was particularly challenging. The social safety net existed but was minimal. Career changes were unusual. Divorce carried significant stigma. The pressure to maintain appearances and stick with one's choices was intense. Yet Rogers observed that those who clung most desperately to certainty were often the most profoundly stuck in meaninglessness. The dark middle asks you to live with questions: who am I if I'm not the role I've been playing? What do I actually want? What am I willing to risk for authenticity? What will I lose if I change? And these questions don't have easy answers. Often, they don't have answers at all at first, just the discomfort of not knowing. Rogers noticed that people in this stage often experienced what he called existential anxiety, not the neurotic anxiety of specific threats, but the deeper anxiety that comes from confronting life's fundamental uncertainties. You can't control everything. You can't make everyone happy. You can't avoid all loss. You will die, and so will everyone you love. These truths are always present, but we usually defend against them. In the dark middle, the defenses have crumbled. But here's what Rogers also observed: people who could stay with this uncertainty, who didn't rush to fill the void with new certainties or retreat to old patterns, often reported something unexpected. The anxiety, while uncomfortable, also felt strangely alive. After years of numbness, they were feeling something real. The uncertainty, while disorienting, also felt like possibility. For the first time in years, the future wasn't just more of the same, it was open. One client described it like this: I realized I'd been living in a very small, very safe box. And yes, I'm terrified now that I've stepped out of it. But I can also breathe for the first time. I don't know what comes next, but for once, I'm curious rather than just dreading more of the same. This is a crucial moment in Rogers' understanding of the path back to meaning. The dark middle isn't a problem to be solved, it's a passage to be moved through. It's where the old self dies before the new self is fully born. Cultures have always had rituals and myths about this: the hero's journey through the underworld, the dark night of the soul, the dissolution before reconstitution. Rogers' contribution was to show that this wasn't mystical, it was psychological, and it was navigable. The key was to maintain the core conditions, stay genuine about what you're experiencing, continue to offer yourself acceptance even in confusion, remain empathically curious about your own process. And crucially, if possible, have at least one relationship where someone else holds those conditions for you. Because the temptation in the dark middle is isolation. You feel like no one could understand, or that you're being selfish, or that you should have it figured out by now. But Rogers knew that this transition is nearly impossible in complete isolation. We need witnesses to our becoming. We need someone to reflect back: you're not broken. You're growing. This discomfort is part of the process. And then, gradually, not through force but through continued honest engagement with your experience, something begins to shift. The uncertainty becomes less terrifying. The old life becomes less magnetic. New possibilities start to appear. You begin to sense what Rogers called the good life, and that's where we go next. The good life, becoming fully functioning. Rogers had a term for the person who has moved through meaninglessness and reconnected with their organismic self, the fully functioning person. It's worth understanding what he meant by this, because it's not what most people imagine when they think about overcoming meaninglessness. The fully functioning person isn't someone who has achieved all their goals, solved all their problems, or attained permanent happiness. They're not necessarily successful by conventional standards. They might not have their life figured out in any final sense. Instead, they have a particular way of being, a process rather than a destination. Rogers identified several characteristics of this way of being. First, openness to experience. The fully functioning person doesn't defensively filter reality to match their preconceptions or protect their self-image. They can take in their feelings, their perceptions, and their experiences, pleasant and unpleasant, without distorting them. They don't need to be right, they can tolerate being wrong. They don't need to be good, they can acknowledge their flaws. In practical terms, this means if you feel angry, you can feel angry without immediately judging yourself as bad or justifying the anger with elaborate stories. If you make a mistake, you can acknowledge it without your entire self-worth collapsing. If life brings pain, you can feel it without needing to pretend it's not there or immediately fix it. This openness is what allows for genuine learning and adaptation. Second, existential living. The fully functioning person lives in the present moment rather than being dominated by past conditioning or future anxieties. They respond to what's actually happening rather than to scripts or rigid plans. This doesn't mean they're impulsive or don't plan, it means they hold plans lightly and can adjust as reality unfolds. Rogers noticed that people trapped in meaninglessness were often either stuck in the past, things made sense when I was younger, or focused on a future that would supposedly bring meaning, once I achieve X, then life will matter. The present moment was just something to get through. The fully functioning person has reversed this. The present moment is where life actually happens, and they're fully there for it. Third, trust in their organism. This is central. The fully functioning person has learned to trust their own experience as a valid guide for decisions and actions. They don't ignore logic or advice from others, but they also don't override their inner knowing with purely rational calculations or others' expectations. They've learned to sense, does this feel right for me? And they trust that sense. This trust doesn't mean they're always certain or never doubt themselves. It means they've developed confidence in their ability to navigate uncertainty using their organismic experience as a compass. They know the difference between fear that's warning them of genuine danger and fear that's just resistance to growth. They can distinguish between discomfort that means wrong direction and discomfort that means growing pains. Fourth, creativity and adaptability. Because they are not rigidly following scripts or defending fixed positions, fully functioning people tend to be more creative in how they approach life. They can try new things, adjust when something isn't working, and generate novel solutions. They're not trying to fit themselves into predetermined roles or achieve predetermined outcomes, they're sculpting their life as they go. And fifth, perhaps most relevant to our topic, the sense of meaning that comes from within. The fully functioning person doesn't need to justify their existence through external achievements or validation. They experience life itself as inherently meaningful because they're genuinely living it rather than performing it. Meaning arises naturally from authentic engagement. Now, it's important to understand, Rogers didn't think this was a permanent state that, once achieved, you maintain forever. He saw it as a direction of travel. The fully functioning person is someone who is in the process of becoming more genuine, more open, more trusting of themselves. Some days you're more fully functioning than others. The point isn't perfection, it's direction. In post-war Britain, as in most of the Western world, the cultural definition of a successful life was quite different from Rogers' vision. Success meant proper roles, achievements, status, security, external markers. Rogers was proposing something more radical, that a good life was defined by internal qualities like congruence, openness, and trust in one's organism. This was quietly revolutionary. What does this look like in practice? It might look like a solicitor who realizes law isn't for him and retrains as a carpenter, not because carpentry is inherently more meaningful, but because it's more aligned with his actual interests and temperament. It might look like a mother who sets boundaries with extended family, not because she doesn't love them, but because she needs to protect her own well-being to be genuinely present for her children. It might look like someone choosing a less prestigious but more engaging career path. Or staying in a difficult situation because, upon honest examination, it's actually worth the difficulty. Or leaving a relationship that looks perfect from the outside but feels hollow inside. Or staying in one that looks troubled from the outside but feels deeply real. The key is that these aren't decisions made from fear, obligation, or others' expectations. They're made from a place of genuine self-knowing. And that's where real meaning lies, not in any particular outcome, but in the process of living from your actual self. But this brings us to a final question: how do you actually start this process? Especially if you're deep in meaninglessness right now, if everything we've discussed seems intellectually interesting but practically distant? That's what we need to address. The first steps, practical applications for today. Understanding Roger's ideas is one thing. Actually using them to move from meaninglessness back to meaning is another. So let's get practical. If you're someone for whom everything seems meaningless right now, where do you actually start? First, begin with honest acknowledgement. Don't try to talk yourself out of meaninglessness or shame yourself for feeling it. Rogers would say, start by accepting that this is genuinely your experience right now. Say it out loud if you can: right now, life feels meaningless to me. This isn't wallowing, it's honesty. And honesty is the foundation of everything that follows. Notice if there's a voice that immediately responds with, but I shouldn't feel this way, or other people have it worse, or I have so much to be grateful for. That's the conditioned voice. You're not saying those things aren't true, you're saying they're not the whole truth. The whole truth includes your actual feeling of meaninglessness, and that deserves acknowledgement. Second, start creating small spaces for congruence. You don't need to overhaul your entire life immediately. Begin with moments where you can be a bit more genuine. Maybe that's with one trusted friend, where instead of saying, I'm fine, you say, honestly, I'm struggling right now. Maybe it's in a journal where no one else will read. Maybe it's in how you respond when someone asks what you want to do. Instead of defaulting to I don't mind, you pause and check, what do I actually want? These small moments of congruence are like cracks in the false self. They let air in. They remind you that there's a real person under the performance. And they tend to accumulate. Each genuine moment makes the next one slightly easier. Third, practice the pause. Throughout your day, when you're making decisions or rests,